And we're keeping the momentum going, ladies and gentlemen. It's time to decode the economy in greater detail with Pranjal Bhandari of HSBC. She is Chief India and Indonesia economist. And I'd like to extend, on behalf of everyone at Perspectives 2022, a warm welcome to Pranjal. Hi, Pranjal.
Hi, happy to be here.
Pranjal, it's over to you, and I leave it to you to decide whether you'd like to walk around as you talk, and the podium is all at your disposal as well. Thanks very much for being here.
Yeah. Thanks, Manvi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to be here today. It's always a bit unnerving to come after Neelkant Mishra, but hum mein hai dam, so we'll try to do a good job. So look, my presentation, I call it Did You Know? And I'm hoping that with every slide, I tell you something new, give you a fresh insight. And by the time I'm done, you also get a sense of my outlook on the state of the economy. The alternate name for this presentation would have been Stars versus Cars. And that would probably mean that, I'm trying to talk in a balanced way. I will focus on all the exciting things that is happening in the economy, but I can't disregard the scars. And we have collected a few of them over the last couple of years. So I'm hoping that in the next 20-25 minutes, I give you a balanced perspective. Sounds good, Manvi?
Perfect.
Great. Okay, so my first slide. Do you know that exports have been the key driver of India's recovery coming out of the pandemic? Now, nowhere in the world is India considered an exporting powerhouse. Even a part of our GDP, exports is only 20%. But it played a massive role in the recovery out of the pandemic. In fact, if you compare how much we grew between June 2019 and June 2022, actually GDP has only grown a cumulative 4%. But exports have grown by 20%. So it's not private consumption, it's not private investment or even public investment. It's exports that has driven growth. And within that exports, there's a very interesting story emerging, which I think is going to outlast the pandemic. We find that high-tech exports, both IT services and also high-tech goods manufacturing, are really gaining market share. In a way, you can say we were lucky when we went into the pandemic. The world was demanding things which India sort of luckily was able to produce. For instance, IT services, mobile handsets, drugs and pharma. And we really grabbed that opportunity and we ran ahead and we really were able to gain market share in the globe on all of these products. Unfortunately, there's a flip side to it, which is that low-tech and medium-tech exports haven't done well. Things like agriculture, textiles, leather products, they haven't really done well, and that's a bummer for the simple reason that that's where a lot of jobs comes from. That's a problem, let's come back to that later, but the good news is that high-tech exports have done very well. But having said that, and I think even Neelkant was very clear about it, if the world economy begins to slow in the next couple of quarters over the next year, then we are going to see the same high-tech exports also slowing a little bit. And in fact, I must say that the August trade report gave me the first signal that high-tech goods volumes was actually slowing, and we have to live with it. It's how the global economy is. But that doesn't take away from the fact that exports have been a good performer in the last couple of years. The second driver of growth, which has kept all of us excited over the last few quarters, is the fact that people have come out of the lockdown, schools have opened, holidays are back in play, restaurants are full. There is a lot of high-touch services demand out there in the system. And that has given us growth over the next couple of quarters. Remember when we got into lockdowns, millions of Indians who went back from urban India to rural India because they lost their job? Well, you know what? Most of them have come back. Today, urban employment is pretty much where it was pre-pandemic. But that's also a problem because we were seeing some growth as they were coming back from rural to urban. Every time an Indian moves from rural India to urban India, incomes go up 2.5 times. Wages go up that much, and they spend much more, because urban jobs are far more paying. But that whole growth fillip we got from people moving back is now over, because in the last couple of months, we've seen that this whole transition back to urban India is complete. Cutting a long story short, two big drivers of growth, exports and pent-up services demand and the return of labor and return of urban jobs are now coming to an end, and we have to brace for a 2023, which is going to be weak. I think growth this year is going to be 6.8%, and I think growth next year is going to be 5.7%. We can talk same time next year to see how right or wrong I am, but right now, my assessment is actually weaker than what many other people think. People think about 7 to 8% growth even now. I'm going to sort of shift gear to, from growth to macro stability. Macro stability is stuff like inflation, fiscal deficit, current account deficit, rupee, all of that. And I sort of, after looking at a lot of data, I must say that the formalization that we are sort of praising in the last couple of years has also been a source of macro stability in our economy. Large firms got larger through the pandemic. When they got larger, their profitability, their sales, all of that grew. This is a very sort of simple metric. It's basically formal sector corporate sales minus GDP. Generally, GDP and corporate sales should move in step, but only in few periods we see corporate sales move much faster than nominal GDP growth, which is a way of saying that the formal sector is gaining market share, and we've seen that in a big way, during the pandemic period. Now, the formal sector also pays taxes. A lot of the informal sector is not in the tax net, but formal sector pays taxes. And therefore, the government's revenues have really increased. Whatever the government thought their revenues would be at the start of the year, the tax revenues are much higher. In fact, it's a strange situation that the government doesn't know how to spend it quickly. It's sitting with a lot of cash. The government is surprisingly very cash rich right now. Now, once the government became cash rich, it was able to do a lot of stuff. One thing it did was that it doubled its fertilizer subsidies from 1 trillion to 2 trillion. The second thing it did was it cut oil taxes. And both of these have helped keep inflation low. Today, had the government not cut oil taxes, our inflation would have been much higher than where it is right now. So in a way, I say that the macro stability that we are seeing right now is a gift of formalization that we've seen over the last couple of years. But unfortunately, that story hasn't yet ended. Because you know what? This formalization wasn't organic formalization. It wasn't that small firms over time became medium, and then they became large, and then they came into the tax net, they started paying taxes. I call this forced formalization. The fact that, so many weeks of lockdown actually, created a situation in which many small and medium firms actually shut shop. And how this story ends is unclear, and it's key. Because if these small firms, this informal sector, makes a comeback, then some of the benefits of formalization will go away. But if it doesn't make a comeback, then there are a lot of people who would have taken income hit, because the informal sector is a far bigger employer than the formal sector, and the government will have to really increase social welfare spending. So the formalization story so far has been great, but how it ends is unclear. I'm going to shift gear now towards, inflation. And even in inflation, I want to talk about something which a lot of people sort of, they know, but they sort of don't want to acknowledge, which is climate change. We've looked at this carefully, and, it's very clear that over the last 3 to 5 years, climate change has actually completely altered India's rain patterns, reservoir patterns, cropping patterns, food inflation patterns. I love talking about reservoir levels. I know in India we love talking about rains, but I think reservoirs does a much better job than rains because not only does it capture how much it's raining, but it also captures how much moisture there is in the ground from previous rain episodes. So it's a much better, wholesome indicator of the water availability for crops, as in that's a small point. But if you look at reservoir levels, it is very critical in India for reservoir levels to be high in June and July, particularly in the Kharif season, because that's when much of the rice sowing happens. But what we are seeing in the last couple of years is that it doesn't rain enough in June and July, and the reservoir levels are not that high enough. It begins to rain quite a lot in August and September, but it's too late for rice sowing. These kind of changes in weather patterns, cropping patterns, then play havoc with food prices, something that we are seeing this year, even in rice, because it rained late or it didn't rain very much in some areas. We were not able to sow a lot in the important months of June and July. Another problem with climate change is that extreme weather events have become far more frequent. Remember that heat wave from March? It was the worst heat wave in 100 years. Suddenly, there was a huge demand for electricity. Our power companies did not have enough coal. They had to quickly go and import from around the world. That was also the time when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, so coal prices were elevated, and we had a big problem for a couple of months. These kind of things are becoming more frequent than not. And what this does is that it makes prices volatile. Energy prices, electricity prices, food prices, and over time, all prices. It's very hard to get your forecasts on inflation right. Forecasting errors have been increasing over time. Inflation expectations, where households feel inflation is going to go, that starts rising because households are always very nervous, and this makes the job for the central bank very difficult. How do you bring down inflation? How do you bring down inflation expectations at a time when there are just so many climate change related events and you have no control on them? So my sense is that this is something that the RBI will have to work with. There are ways around it. One way is, start increasing rates early. Because if you do big increases early on, you control inflation expectations, and over time you don't actually have to increase rates very much. But all of these are things the RBI will have to figure out, as they go ahead, because climate change is an important reality. Having said that, I also think that it's going to be the fall in food inflation that is going to help India at least in the next 12 months. So where is inflation right now? My forecast is about 6.9%. Next year, we think it's going to go down to 5.5%. What's going to drive this disinflation? It's not going to be fuel prices as much. It's not going to be core inflation as much, which is all the goods and services you buy. Is going to be food inflation that helps us. And I sort of say this because this government is good at sort of managing short-term food price problems. This is a chart from 2016 to 2019. I like this chart because inflation here averaged 4%, which is India's inflation target. But see what drove it. It was food. It was food inflation that was 3%. Core was actually pretty high. It was food inflation that allowed India to be at the target inflation level during this period. And my sense is that with a national election coming in 2024, this government is going to do everything it can to control food inflation. And what are the few things it can do? Things like clamping down on hoarders, importing, exporting, more interstate transport of food grains, all the different small things it can do, it's going to try to do, and I think food inflation is going to help us. But will inflation come down all the way to 4%, which is the RBI's target? And my answer is no. As in, I forecast 3 years out. That's the sort of visibility I can have, with all the different data that we track. I just don't see inflation coming down to 4. As in, if we are very lucky, it'll come down to 5, but I just don't see it coming down to 4. But then this also begs the question, is 4% the right inflation target for us to have? And I think this is not just going to be a question India will have to answer. This is a question the world will have to answer. The world order has changed. We are deglobalizing. all of us have a lot of fat. We have very high fiscal deficits that over time, becomes inflationary. Our labor preferences are changing. They don't want to work the way they were working in the past. All of this over time can increase structural inflation, and India will have to then revisit what the inflation forecast will be. I'm going to move on to fiscal, the government's accounts. And there's both bad and good news here. I think the bad news is that about 50% of the central government's tax revenues is going into debt servicing, is going into paying the interest cost of this large debt that it holds. This is extremely inefficient. This is a country which has a huge infrastructure gap. This is a country which has a huge social welfare gap. And spending 50% of your tax revenues on interest servicing, it's a problem. So we need fiscal consolidation. We need our fiscal deficit to come down so our debt won't rise and our interest costs won't rise. So fiscal consolidation is very key. But how will this fiscal consolidation happen? And here I'm going to get to the good news. One great thing that has happened through the pandemic is that capital expenditure, the expenditure on CapEx by central government has increased. Now, you can blame me that this chart is a bit misleading because the two lines are on different axes. But I just had to celebrate the fact that the black line is rising. It's, I actually haven't seen it rise in the last 10 years. So seeing government's CapEx spending rise from 1.7% of GDP to, almost just a little less than double is something that is heartening for me. But now what will happen to this in the face of fiscal consolidation? I think that's going to be a very big challenge. What generally India does is that whenever it's pressured to bring down the fiscal deficit, it just cuts the CapEx budget. And that's the reason why our CapEx doesn't rise. This is the first time our CapEx has risen. And I hope that the fiscal consolidation that we see is led by revenue side reforms and not by CapEx cuts. And I think that's going to be a very important question. By the way, one small sort of side comment. What is the importance of central government CapEx? We talk about it a lot, but actually the numbers are not great. As in 2% of GDP, 3% of GDP is very small. 75% of annual investment in India is actually done by the private sector. Only 25% is done by public sector. And within this 25, central government is only 40% of this 25%. So actually, in the larger scheme of things, central government CapEx doesn't add to very much. But it has a lot of confidence sort of signals. When there is a sense that, oh, the center is doing CapEx, the center is spending, it does bring some sort of confidence into the private sector, and then it crowds in private sector investment over time. And I just sort of wanted to lay it out, because I know these numbers look very small, but they have a sort of a multiplier effect because of the crowding in that they are able to generate. I'm going to move to the trade deficit part, the external finances, because this is the #1 question we get from investors, or especially overseas investors who invest into India, that what's going on with the rupee, what's going on with the external balance. Now, the truth is that our trade deficit has ballooned. It used to average about $14 to $15 billion a month, and last 3 months it has averaged almost $30 billion a month. Almost doubling. And every metric we see, trade balance, current account balance, BOP balance, all the different metrics of external funding, all of them are falling into deep deficits. What generally happens in these periods is that the rupee comes under pressure and the rupee starts to weaken a lot. In India, we haven't seen the rupee weaken much. Since the start of the year, the dollar has strengthened 16%. But the rupee has only weakened about 8%. Given that it's a huge oil importer, given that this has been a big oil shock, anyone would have predicted at the start of the year that rupee should have depreciated much more than it has. And the reason it has not depreciated much is because the RBI is out there aggressively selling dollars, keeping the rupee from weakening. In the last 4 months, our sense is that it's already spent about $75 billion in just keeping the rupee from depreciating too much. This is a run rate of $4 billion a week. It's a very large number. The problem here is that, it's done this so far, but our forecast, and I think now it's sort of something which is very well known, that all the external metrics, trade balance, current account balance, BOP, are going to remain in deficit for the next year or 2 or 3. Over the medium term is going to remain in deficit. And the RBI may soon lose too many reserves. Already people are very nervous about the burn rate, of the FX reserves. So look, we are not in a crisis situation. We still have a lot of reserves with us, but we have to become very careful about every dollar that we are spending right now because it's falling, very quickly. What should the policy implication be? My sense is let the rupee weaken a little bit. It's not going to change. If the rupee is 79.9 or if it's 81.5, it doesn't really sort of matter that much. But what it does externally is that it makes your exports a little more competitive. It cuts out some of the unnecessary imports. And it also gives a sense that the rupee is now finally fairly balanced. And on the back of that, a lot of new investment money can come into the country. So my sense is that what the RBI really needs to do now is to step back a little bit, gradually let the rupee depreciate, and I think that will have a bit of a self-correction associated with it. So look, everything I've said right now is, giving a sense of calm, right? You've had the RBI, intervening a lot, and therefore the rupee is a bit stable. There is a sense that the inflation may have peaked. The government will do a great job in food management. There's a sense that because of the formalization revenues, fiscal deficit is not blowing out, every other quarter, and that has kept the bond yield, in good levels. In fact, we've seen some rally in the bond market in the last month or so. So there seems to be a calm out there. But I'm always nervous about calms because of what can follow. And I hope that we take the right steps to avoid a storm. What can some of the steps be that we can take? I think one is the government should do everything in terms of food distribution management to keep food inflation low. The RBI should let the rupee weaken. The government should also try to increase revenue reforms, for example, disinvestment, so the fiscal consolidation is not led by capex cuts. And overall, the most important thing, we have to continue with reforms. That's the only way you get good medium-term growth. Some reforms are already happening, like GST, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, our lovely digital framework, but many reforms are still, to happen. We failed in some reforms, like agriculture, no problem. Let's pull it back up. Let's, constantly build consensus, but let's always try to push towards more and more reforms. With this, I'm going to sort of come to the second part, which probably will not be as long. But I think what I said so far, basically, one message is clear, at least to me, that 2023 is going to be tough. Growth will slow. And, all of this pressure in the currency, there are like all kinds of pressures out there. Inflation is likely to remain higher than target. So 2023 is going to be a wobbly year, and it's going to be a tough one for us and for practically every country. But I also feel happy that what lies beyond this is our greener pastures. I do think there are a lot of exciting things happen, in India. I know the previous speaker spoke about it, but here is my take. I think that while we were sitting at home locked up in the COVID years, there were two new sectors that emerged. One was high-tech exports. We already spoke about it. The fact that we've gained market share in things like IT services, mobile handsets, drugs and pharma, specialized engineering goods, specialized chemicals. And I think that's here to stay over the medium term. The second is the entire ecosystem of startups. It's already attracted $125 billion over the last couple of years. It's going through a period of cleanup, a period in which some of the froth and the excesses are getting removed, and I think it's healthy, I think it's good, because it will make this sector far more nimble. But I'm very excited about this sector, not because of what it is doing right now, but because of all the challenges, it could take up tomorrow and try to address some of India's big problems. I think it can be a game changer. I call this set of high-tech exports and startups as New India. It's exciting. It's got a lot of technology involved. It's using the digital infrastructure. This is what I call New India. And I think if New India continues to grow, our potential growth can rise from about 6% to about 6.5% over the next couple of years. And I think that's good. It's always good to see the potential growth of a country increase. But will that be good enough? And the answer is no. Because New India can be very shiny, very attractive, but it's only 15% of India's GDP, and it employs only 6% of India's labor force. So even if it grows very rapidly, it can't really create the jobs that the country needs. What more is needed? And here I'm excited to say that I think some exciting things can happen. I think our challenge is to ensure that New India spills over into old India, digital India spills over into physical India. And what I find very exciting is the whole prospect of digitization of manufacturing. Now, India's tragedy is that it has too small firms which always remain small. Economists like Arvind Panagaria call it India's dwarfs. Small firms which always remain small. And small and medium firms are actually 90% of India's manufacturing landscape. The problem with this is that these firms never enjoy economies of scale. We're not able to compete with a lot of other countries. What I think digitization of manufacturing can do is to allow small firms to feel like they are large firms. So think about like a startup, and there are a few, one or two, who have already tried to take up this challenge, which can actually aggregate a bunch of small companies, for example, say 20,000 glass manufacturing companies, combine their order, get them access to bulk discounts in the raw material market, get them access to credit, with new innovations like account aggregator, teach them digital quality checks, at every point of manufacturing, how do you ensure that, the quality is maintained, and also then access to large buyers, overseas buyers with the help of many of these new, e-commerce platforms, including the new ONDC. Because if that can succeed, and we can help small firms feel like they're large firms and get some of the efficiency gains, then I think there's a lot of there's a lot of like hope of growth from there. I just want to make a side point here that digitization is not a substitute for reforms. Reforms is the real thing. Reforms is, things like reducing regulatory burden so small firms can organically grow over time. That's the real thing. Things like digitization are complements, and they are sort of friends for some time until the real thing happens. So digitization should happen, alongside reforms and should not substitute the reforms, and we should sort of keep that at the back of our mind. But my own work suggests that if we can actually do this successfully, digitization of manufacturing processes, we will solve a lot of India's growth problems. Here in this chart, I have something I call missing jobs. In the next decade, how many of India's jobs will not be there, as in people are there demanding the job, but there's no supply of jobs, so they're sitting at home. And business as usual, which is that India continues to grow at about 6%, where it was growing pre-pandemic. That shows a very high 30 million missing jobs. Then I have a scenario 1, where I sort of assume that New India takes off, all the shiny stuff, high-tech exports, startups. That, my sense is, will fill some of the jobs, but not all. We'll still have 20 million missing jobs. It's only in my scenario 2, where I actually account for New India spilling over into old India, digitization of manufacturing processes and all of that, that I see a serious sort of answer to the jobs problem. A third of the jobs problem can get addressed. And I think this one is powerful. Do I have about 2-3 minutes more?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay, this one last topic I wanted to just touch upon before I end is green transition. As in, a lot of people are like, oh my God, everybody's doing it, we got to do it. But I actually think it's a huge source of opportunity for India, and I'll tell you why. 60% of India's capital stock, basically its infrastructure, all its investments, all its factories, buildings, that we are going to have in 2040 is not yet built. Right? So all we have to do is to build from today in a green way. And by 2040, we'll see that a lot of the goods and services we produce will have a green stamp and will give us a huge opportunity in the global market. This is very different from the experience of some other countries, for example, South Korea, which has actually built a lot of its capital stock already. And it will have to spend a lot of money in refitting, in changing brown to green. But for us, we don't have such a huge fitting cost because we haven't built a lot of our capital yet. So we just have to build from today in a green way. And then when by 2040, a lot of our exports and what we produce has a green stamp, then that will give a big fillip to India's exports. And I think that will be very exciting. You know, there was this exports sort of a bus, a bandwagon, which came a couple of decades ago with China leading the way. We didn't climb on, you know, we didn't get into the value chains then. This is a new bus that is coming. And you know, it's for us to climb this, and we have the right material to climb this. So I'm very excited about climate change as an opportunity. But look, like every big thing, every good thing, you have to work hard because the transition years could be bumpy. You know, inflation, as I spoke earlier, could become far more volatile because of climate change, and the RBI will have to work very hard to control it. Fiscal revenues could be lost because at the end of the day, you know, fossil fuel, coal, petrol, and all of that is a huge source of revenue for the government, you know, about 20 to 25% of its overall revenues, about 3 to 3.5% of GDP. That will go away, so the government will have to compensate for that by other revenue side reforms. And then even India's trade deficit, it could widen. Like, think about it. Today we are all trying to promote EVs. But think about a day when everyone starts buying an EV, and all of these EV batteries are imported. Imagine what's going to happen to our trade deficit. See, the benefit of an EV, that you will not be using petrol and diesel, comes over time. It's staggered through the life cycle of a car, you know, of using a car. But the cost of an EV is upfront. You get the battery on day one. So in the short run, the trade deficit could really balloon. And here the government will have to play a very important role in sequencing things very carefully. So before you really incentivize EVs to consumers, you should build some capacity to produce EV batteries at home. So, you know, things like that. Sequencing will become very important, and this is something which the government will have to manage, you know, very carefully think about the incentives it's giving to people. You know, I'm sort of done with that. I'll just make some concluding remarks. You know, there seems to be a calm right now. Activity indicators are improving. The rupee is stable. Bond yields have just rallied over the last month. But we worry that things are going to change. Growth could slow. Global growth is slowing. We worry that our external finances are vulnerable. We worry that the government has to take on a huge challenge of fiscal consolidation, and 2023 is going to be a rocky year. But if we are able to manage to cross it, I think the pastures that sort of lie ahead are very exciting. High-tech exports, startups, and then their spillover into old India, you know, into our manufacturing, into our infrastructure, can really get us good growth. But we have to work hard for all of it. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pranjal. You know, you say that economics is very creative, and that you see your role as sort of researching and figuring out what is often lost in plain sight. And I think that sentiment really came through in your presentation as well. I want to quickly touch upon some of the scenarios that you had built up. And one of those scenarios is if new India spills into old India. Okay? Now, since you like doing that kind of research, is there heartening evidence you see of this idea of digitalization of manufacturing?
So it's very new. I see that it has picked up in some other countries, like Europe. But in India, we still have, you know, 2 to 3 startups which look very promising, but have just started to work on it. So we'll see where it goes. But I do think that the ingredients are there. You know, like everything that a firm does when it's producing a good or services, for every, you know, access to raw material, access to credit, access to technology, logistics, access to warehousing, access to final big export or domestic markets, all of this can use the digital framework very easily, not only e-commerce platform, but also innovations in artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very promising area, but you're right that it's still very new. And actually, that's why I brought it up, because no use talking about it when it's already done.
And in that same spirit, I'm always puzzled when India has leapfrogged in many different ways. I mean, you look at financial services and digitalization there. You look at EdTech. There's so much leapfrogging happening. But when it comes to green tech, that leapfrogging is not clear and visible. And could it be because it comes with associated bumpiness, and that, structurally is what is holding us back?
Yeah, I think so. I think this transition is not going to be easy for anyone.
Sure.
I must say that the European countries and the US, even China, and some other parts of the world, they are sort of like doing much more even now than we are, as in we sort of started late, although in the last 5 years we've made a lot of advancement. But they're also not finding it easy. As in, look at what Europe is going through right now. They have disincentivized investment in fossil fuel. But their renewables capacity is not yet predictable. And they are going through huge sort of weather-related shocks. Suddenly, they don't have any electricity available. Remember, the wind speed was very low in Europe in September last year, and therefore they suddenly had to go and buy a lot of gas because their wind energy didn't live up to the promise. So the whole world is learning. It's not going to be easy for anyone. I think we are lucky in the sense that we started a decade late. So at every point, we can learn from the mistakes that somebody before us made. Yeah.
I'm going from possibilities to realities, and I'll get to realities in literally 2 minutes, but I do want to stick with the possibilities right now. And compelling when you talked about the employment that gets generated at 7% plus growth, but the ingredients for that 7% plus growth are tough ingredients to put together at this stage, right?
Yeah, they are. If you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would say it's going to take a very long time. It will happen, as in, economies do grow over time, but it needs so many reforms. Our big problem is, as I mentioned, that too many small firms remain small for very long. What comes in the way? Why don't they grow bigger? And there are a host of reasons, right? Land problem, labor problem, hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure in the form of skilled labor, then huge regulatory cholesterol, because every time you grow bigger, there are many new regulations that you have to abide by. So there are just so many disincentives associated with growth that small firms remain small. And until you get this host of reforms done, I would have thought that, our sort of manufacturing dwarfs would remain dwarfs and we would not become efficient. This digitization, if it can really, come up in a big way, manufacturing digitization, I think this can buy us some more time, provide us some more efficiency until the actual reforms are done. So that is the positivity that I feel.
I think you've already given us a flavor of the kind of reforms you consider critical. So I'm going to move from possibilities to realities. And the here and now, starts with what you're tracking most closely as far as the global macroeconomic picture is concerned. I mean, what's your preoccupation, if I want to put it like that, or what is the most important development that you're tracking? The visibly hawkish stance by the US Federal Reserve, how high or low does it feature?
Yeah, look, I'm tracking the growth inflation mix around the world. That's the most important thing right now. My worry is that with all the uncertainties that there are, growth could begin to slow faster than inflation falls into target range for most of the countries around the world. And today we have, for example, Fed making it very clear that if recession is the price to pay for bringing down inflation, they are ready to pay that price. They haven't seen their labor market weaken yet. but the chances are that it will weaken, and we ourselves in HSBC forecast the unemployment rate in the US going to 5% by the end of 2024. So they will also have to pay a price. And then look at all the other uncertainties around you, as in we don't know when and how the Russia-Ukraine conflict will end. We don't know how successfully China will come out of its COVID problem. It already has some other problems. Its exports are slowing. Housing market is in trouble. We don't know how Europe is going to wean away from its energy dependence on Russia. We don't know how the elections outcome are going to pan out in the US. There's just so many uncertainties right now. And I think all of them directly or indirectly weigh into the growth inflation mix problem around the world. That growth could slow faster than inflation comes down.
And that's what you're therefore tracking most closely. Back to India, its macroeconomic indicators. You said, it's time for perhaps the RBI, you suggested that in your presentation, to really revisit its inflation target in the first place, right? But the pulls and pressures, food disinflation, you clearly outlined, but core inflation, your concern is it stays sticky.
Yeah, and that's the irony, because food and fuel are like what economists call exogenous shocks. Like, fuel, we are price takers in the world, in the globe. And food, a lot of it comes, depends on rains, weather gods, and all of that. So in a way, the only part of inflation we can control is core inflation. And actually, the whole interest, RBI increasing interest rates, that should be working to bring down core inflation, right? That is RBI's job. And in a way, I'm saying that RBI will probably not be very successful with its job. And that's why we'll have to look at the government to create some magic and bring down food inflation. So it's sort of a little counterintuitive. But the reason I'm saying this is because core inflation is extremely high and sticky right now. And you know what? It's been high and sticky since 2020. The world went into an inflation problem in 2021. Nobody, barring one or two countries, had an inflation problem in 2020. And yet, in 2020, India had very high core inflation. So it's been there in the system for a very long time. And my worry is it will be hard to bring it down. Couple of reasons. One is that large firms have gotten larger through the pandemic. They have gained a lot of pricing power. They hiked prices when input costs were going up. But when input costs fall, will they also cut prices? In India, we've seen that there's a lot of downward stickiness. So that's one. The second is the fact that a lot of these inflation problems are long cycles, right? Global prices went up, but our discoms, our energy distribution companies, haven't really increased all the electricity tariffs yet. They always do it in a very bureaucratic way over time. It takes about a year. So that inflation pressure is still to come. Third, we still have such a high fiscal deficit, and high fiscal deficit over time becomes inflationary. We've seen that in most emerging markets. We've definitely seen that in India. So there are a lot of reasons why core inflation could remain elevated, and the pressure is on food inflation.
And it's, like you said, so counterintuitive. But I get distracted by the fact that you track reservoir trends, because I find that fascinating, instead of the habitual focus on rainfall. But I'm not going to get distracted right now. Later, remind me to ask you what prompted you to start tracking reservoir trends. How is everything that you just outlined likely to shape RBI action? And I think the subtext of what you said is there is a certain amount of ineffectiveness we've seen in action so far. Or am I paraphrasing too loosely?
Well, look, no, I think RBI has done a lot, as in the few things we were blaming the RBI for, that look, you've not hiked rates or liquidity is so loose. They've hiked rates a lot now. They're giving you like 40 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, like back-to-back large increases. So they're doing it. And even liquidity, as in nobody is complaining about excess banking sector liquidity right now. If anything, and I'm sure many of you are tracking it, banking sector liquidity has fallen to a deficit in the last couple of days. So I think, you can't really blame RBI, like, it's sort of easy to blame, but it's just how things have evolved. There's just been so much uncertainty, so much volatility, in the system. But my sense is, RBI needs to start focusing on only one thing. When India signed up for inflation targeting, there was a reason. And one of the reasons was it has been very successful in many countries. And the reason it has been very successful is because it makes the central bank focused. You focus on inflation, and then, there's something very special about inflation. Once that is under control, different parts of the macroeconomy fall into place. And once that is out of control, it messes up with every part of your economy. It's so clear to me watching data, macro trends, year after year, that today if our inflation remains high, the poor will feel poorer because their purchasing power will go down. There'll be pressure on social welfare schemes. Fiscal deficit will get, widen. If inflation is high, which company will want to invest? There's so much of price uncertainty. They'll wait for inflation to come down. Investment rate will fall. Growth will fall. If inflation is high, actually many people, they feel that it'll get higher if you're in a vicious cycle, and then they prepone their spending, and that increases the trade deficit and current account deficit. It's sort of a slightly academic point, but we see that happen all the time. So inflation can sometimes be the root cause of many other problems. And inflation control is very important. RBI has practically one tool, interest rates, should focus interest rates to inflation control. They should, in a way, forget about a lot of the other things they are doing, exchange rate control, growth, RBI dividend.
Don't try to solve every economic problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, what did you call it? Would Archer's focus?
Yeah, it's like, we saw that in Mahabharata, right? Like Arjun was the favored student because when he was asked to sort of take a shot at a wooden bird perched on a tree, and his teacher asked him, what can you see? He said, I can see the wooden bird. And everybody else was like, oh, I can see the leaves, and I can see like this distant person, and and his teacher said that, only Arjun's got the answer right. You just have to focus on this one thing.
And talking about the different priorities that the central bank has set itself, the rupee stable despite the trade deficit and slowing inflows. That's thanks to the RBI's intervention. You said you expect it to last for another 2 to 3 months, aggressive intervention?
Yeah, well, look, to the extent it's doing about $50 to $20 billion a month. I suppose they have firepower to sort of spend about $50 billion. I think after that, we'll begin to come under question.
So you're actually saying it makes sense to allow the rupee to weaken gradually, gently.
Yeah.
That's always the best pace at which to move. Why?
Because once the rupee is a little, look, right now everybody expects the rupee to weaken, as in everybody who's following the FX market, because it absolutely makes no sense that, the dollar has strengthened so much, but the rupee hasn't weakened in comparison. It just makes no sense right now. And what happens is that once the rupee weakens a little bit, it provides some sort of a subsidy to your exports. Your exports get a little more competitive in the market. High-tech exports is a new sector for us. Let's nurture it, particularly at a time when global growth is so sort of, unclear and wobbly.
And the importance of nurturing exports came through very clearly in your presentation, because you said, growth has been actually powered by exports in recent times, and the caution is that it's slowing down now. So this is, in a sense, almost the perfect time to nurture exports, and a competitive currency would go a long way.
Exactly. Yeah, like you sort of said it better. That is it, right? Like it's so clear that you have this one amazing driver of growth, nurture it.
Again, you made the point that, returning jobs, that sort of impact of fillip to growth has played out. So that's not something to count on anymore. What potentially could positively play out, positively and unexpectedly play out on the growth front? Because, if we were sitting 3, 4 years ago, I don't think we would have said exports are going to power growth. Again, you acknowledge that in your presentation. What could we unexpectedly, on the positive side, have playing out to fuel growth?
Ouch, that's a tough one. As in, it's like...
No, because you have a tendency to look, beyond the ordinary when it comes to indicators.
Yeah. Look, I do think that things look very exciting to me in the medium term. And like the last speaker, it's not that I've always been excited about the medium term. I think the medium term has started to excite me now over the last 1.5 years. So I'm excited about that. But the short term, I definitely do think is going to be wobbly. Like wherever I look, I find problems. Like one part we haven't touched upon yet is the growth that we're having domestically in India itself. It's very K-shaped. As in, there are all kinds of divergences. Today, rural India is not doing well, urban India is doing well. Public capex is up, but private capex is not up. We get very excited when for 1 month cement growth goes up, but actually if you look at the whole thing, it's not really up. When you look at forward expectations, corporates seem very excited, but consumers don't seem very excited with all the surveys that the RBI runs. So our own country has so many different contradictions that I think at this point, it's very hard to say that growth will improve or could be good. Yeah, I think the only positive surprise could be if the high-tech exports that we are so good in producing nowadays has some sort of inelasticity attached to it, that global demand for that continues to be high. I think that could sort of be an upside surprise. But the indications of that are not looking that great. In the last 2 months, we are seeing the global tech cycle weaken considerably. Semiconductor chip prices, which was like gold a few months ago, is beginning to fall.
I remember that vividly, yeah. You've also, noted that through the pandemic period, the big companies have got bigger, the small companies have got smaller. So actually on the downside, that's another development to put into the mix, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I think, all the data that I track made it very clear that, that big companies, their profitability went up because they did a lot of, cleanup in the pandemic period. In the lockdown, a lot of companies sort of cut down on some of their excesses, right? Like excess travel or like small excesses. So they've come back far more like efficient from the pandemic after a lot of the restructuring. Then they gain market share because some of the small firms had to just shut down. We can also see that the people who work in large firms got richer because if you look at the wages these large firms pay, the wage bin increased rapidly. So large firms did well and the people who work in the large firms did well. Exactly the opposite for small firms. They could not withstand the lockdown. They don't have the cash balances, cash buffers. They had to go out of business. They're so hand to mouth that there were no efficiency reforms that they could undertake. And now with the commodity price shock, they are not as energy efficient. They also don't have as much bargaining power when they go out there buying raw materials. Like everything that could hurt them is hurting them. And the people who work in these small firms, they've seen their wages and salaries fall dramatically. This is all sort of like from data. I'm actually just saying out facts. So it's been very clear that large companies have gotten larger, the rich have gotten richer, and the opposite.
I'm taking a detour here. I don't think that many in this room would be familiar with your professional trajectory. And I think it's interesting and important to note that at this stage because I think it shapes the perspective you bring to this audience and to your work. From private sector to government, back again to private. Describe that journey for us.
Okay, this is a little embarrassing, but okay, let me just do that. I started off in the government, but I actually joined the UK government for 2 years. And then I moved on to Goldman Sachs, where I was the Asia economist based out of Hong Kong. I left that when I got an opportunity with the government of India at the Planning Commission. I worked there for 2 years, and then I moved to Finance Ministry, where I worked for a couple of years more. After that, I went off to Washington, D.C., where I worked at the IMF. And then I came back and I worked at HSBC.
But the reason I wanted you...
Okay.
The reason I wanted you to share that, because you have experienced it from many ends. And, it's important to keep that in mind when we're listening to did you know? Because often we need it to be pointed in directions that are lost in plain sight. Final remarks from you, Pranjal. This morning I had someone from the audience come up to me, and I'll be honest here, and I'll share it with you. They said, sound more positive. And I sat for a moment and I said, well, do I need to really do that? Maybe I need to do that. And I have been trying to do that. But we do have to balance all of the positives with the real and albeit short-term uncertainty that is facing us. So I'm giving that tough job to you. In the short term, summarize the reasons for a caution. In the medium term, summarize the reasons for optimism.
Yeah. Look, in the short run, we've seen that growth cycles, investment cycles around the world are deeply coordinated, right? Global cycles. And if you have the world economy slowing a lot, India can't be a complete outperformer, right? I think that's one. I think a lot of us feel that we are a very domestic economy, we can be an outperformer. But if we were a domestic economy, then I'll bring you back to my chart. Why is it that private consumption has only risen 4% while exports has risen 20%, right? So we have to put that in perspective. And global economy is showing all the signs of slowing, particularly as central bank heads are saying that if recession is a price for inflation control, we are ready to pay that price. So I think growth is going to slow. We have to be very careful about it. And unfortunately, whenever growth slows, emerging markets comes under more scrutiny. Everybody will come and see, oh, how much is your debt? How much is your FX reserves? You can have some developed economy running, being far worse on those metrics, I'll be honest, or like double the inflation. But for us, we can't. We are scrutinized far more.
Held to a higher standard.
Exactly. And I think all of that is going to pressure us, and I think 2023 is going to be tough year. But having said that, look, we still have a strong amount of FX reserves. We have possibilities of reforms. We have new sectors, and these are things which many other countries don't have. So we'll not do well, but relatively, I think we'll be fine.
Possibilities of reforms. It's a phrase that has come back to me repeatedly in my 20-odd career in the business. And it's wonderful when those actually materialize. So I'm going to wrap this up by asking you to point towards one reform measure that you've seen maybe in the last 2 to 3 years that has brought concrete, but uncelebrated or celebrated, I don't care either way, gains.
Look, we celebrate very quickly. So this one is GST, the Goods and Services Tax Reform. It took 10 years in the making for the bill to get passed. In the first 2 years of its implementation, tax revenue actually fell because it was a mess. No one knew what to do. There was a huge amount of evasion. But we kept working. First we came up with this thing called invoice matching. Then we realized that, people find a way and, evade taxes with invoice matching. So we went to this new thing called, single, single one portal in which you can't do evasion. A single invoice in which you can't do evasion. And I think over the last 2 years or 3 years, the GST is doing well, as in it can do better, like everything else, but it is doing well, as in if you think about GST revenues as a percentage of GDP, it has risen and there have been reforms on the back of that.
And those tax collections have stood India in good stead, in tough times when there was the oil impact to bear or there was subsidies to distribute. So in a sense, that piece has come together rather nicely. That's what you're saying.
Yes, that part has come together. But then, to your point, if you would have told me, mention 3 such reforms, I would have found it hard. And I hope that the next time we talk, there are more reforms like this that are success stories in the recent past.
Pranjal Bhandari, thank you so much for your time. Absolutely wonderful talking to you. We have Matt and Avi right here who'd like to share a token of appreciation.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.